Irregular present verb conjugation in French doesn't follow one fixed pattern. Instead, many irregular French verbs have their own special conjugation, which means that such verbs must be memorized because other patterns for them might not be predictable. In my previous video, I explained regular French verb conjugation in the present, showing verb stems and their endings. In this video, I'll explain irregular present verb conjugation, which may follow the same endings but with changes in verb stems. The good news is that about 17 irregular verbs are used very commonly in French, so you don't need to know all of them. Once you master the common ones, you can use them in any way you want. Still, I will simply show the most common irregular verbs in French, but not all, and in the end, I'll give a simple reference chart of the main irregular verbs in the present tense, which are the ones you'll see most often. This way, you can keep it as a clear guide, but again, such verbs have to be remembered. From the start, French has the big four irregular verbs that are used in everyday speech, and these are être, to be, avoir, to have, aller, to go, and faire, to do or to make. Such verbs will have almost no pattern to follow, so they must be remembered individually. Let's begin with être, to be. The conjugations of this verb in the present tense are je suis, tu es, il, on est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils sont. An example sentence can be je suis étudiant. Now, let's see the conjugations of avoir, to have. J'ai, toi, il, on a, nous avons, vous avez, ils ont. In this case, elision occurs with j'ai and et due to the vowel sounds. An example can be nous avons un chien. Now, let's see aller, to go. Je vais, tu vas, il, on va, nous allons, vous allez, ils vont. An example is ils vont à l'école. Now, let's see faire, to do or to make. Je fais, tu fais, il ou fait, nous faisons, vous faites, ils font. An example is tu fais du sport. Considering the big four irregular verbs, you can see that unlike regular verbs, the stems of these verbs often change, which makes some patterns unpredictable, but at the same time, some endings are preserved. While it can be difficult to remember the stems of these verbs, the endings can be used to predict how some conjugations will end. Now that we've covered the big four, we can move on to other very common irregular verbs that will have basic endings that we saw in the previous video, which will give us predictable patterns. Let's see the verb venir, to come. Je viens, tu viens, on vient, nous venons, vous venez, ils viennent. With this verb, we can see that some basic endings were preserved with irregular changes, like using is and te without I, and o, I, and e without is. Because the verb venir is an ir verb, its endings are basic for ir verbs with irregular changes. An example is je viens de Paris. Now, let's see the verb prendre, to take. Je prends, tu prends, il prend, nous prenons, vous prenez, ils prennent. With this verb, the first three conjugations are regular, but the other three remove a letter from their basic endings. An example is elle prend le train. Let's see the verb vouloir, to want. Je veux, tu veux, il veut, nous voulons, vous voulez, ils veulent. This verb has distinctive stems, with endings that are also similar to those of previous verbs. An example is nous voulons apprendre le français. Let's see the verb pouvoir, to be able to or can. Je peux, tu peux, il peut, nous pouvons, vous pouvez, ils peuvent. This verb has a very similar pattern to the previous verb, with the same endings. An example is je peux parler anglais. Let's see the verb devoir, to have to or must. Je dois, tu dois, il ou doit, nous devons, vous devez, ils doivent. This verb has particular stems, again with endings that are similar to those of previous verbs. An example is vous devez étudier. Let's see the verb savoir, to know. Je sais, tu sais, il ou sait, nous savons, vous savez, ils savent. Considering that this is a ir verb, some of its basic endings are used, but the main irregularity comes from removing a letter from the infinitive, leaving it as savent. An example is je sais la réponse. Let's see the verb mettre, to put. Je mets, tu mets, il ou met, nous mettons, vous mettez, ils mettent. This verb has basic endings in its category, but it's irregular because it removes a consonant from the stem in the first three conjugations. An example is il met la table. Let's see the verb dire, to say. Je dis, tu dis, il ou dit, nous disons, vous dites, ils disent. While preserving most basic endings, this verb is irregular because of the conjugation for vous, which uses the consonant t and ends in is. An example is vous dites la vérité. Let's see the verb partir, to leave. Je pars, tu pars, il on part, nous partons, vous partez, ils partent. This verb preserves some basic endings with irregular changes, like is and te without I and o, e, and e without is. An example is il part à midi. Let's see the verb sortir, to go out. Je sors, tu sors, il ou sort, nous sortons, vous sortez, ils sortent. This verb also preserves some basic endings with irregular changes, but the main irregularity is the removal of a letter from the infinitive, leaving sors as the stem. An example is je sors avec mes amis. Let's see the verb boire, to drink. Je bois, tu bois, il ou boit, nous buvons, vous buvez, ils boivent. This verb also preserves basic endings from previous verbs, while changing the stems in some conjugations. An example is tu bois de l'eau. Let's see the verb lire, to read. Je lis, tu lis, il ou lit, nous lisons, vous lisez, ils lisent. This verb also preserves basic endings from previous verbs, while having an additional letter in the stems of some conjugations. An example is il lit au journal. Let's finish with écrire, to write. Tu écris, on écrit, nous écrivons, vous écrivez, ils écrivent. This verb also preserves basic endings from previous verbs, while having an additional letter in the stems of some conjugations. Moreover, elision occurs with j'ai and écrit due to the vowel sounds. An example is nous écrivons une lettre. Overall, this is how irregular verbs work in the present tense in French. These are the most common irregular verbs that are used in everyday speech, so it's not necessary to learn all irregular verbs in French. This chart has all of the verbs that I showed, so you can study it and keep it as a guide and remember the conjugations of common irregular verbs. The next big step is to read small French texts to see the verbs in context and build your own simple sentences, because this way your fluency in French will be faster and better.